Imagine, dear viewer, that you are writing the script for a major movie or television show, one that will be seen by millions of people, many of them teenagers or even children. You are tasked with bringing to life the characters whose stories will portray the themes of the narrative, with ensuring that your audience will relate to and be inspired by said characters. And you also happen to care deeply about a completely unrelated political issue. What do? You hold in your hand this enormous power, the ability to ensure that your opinion reaches countless potentially impressionable minds around the globe. Could you possibly resist the temptation to inject your political beliefs into the story which you are writing?
That's impossible!
If you answered yes, congratulations on having integrity and understanding what your theoretical job actually entails. There is a long-running debate, or rather internet shouting match, about whether or not politics belong in movies, shows, video games, and so forth. Some people say, keep your politics off my art, while others insist that all art is political, or that stories like Star Wars have always been political, backed up with evidence such as this George Lucas interview.
I want to figure out how democracies give themselves over to tyrants.
Any human with the slightest concept of nuance will of course detect a significant difference between what good old George is describing and the random off-the-cuff politically charged one-liners such as these.
Elf workers, taking your trains!
My panda, my choice, Mom.
The former is political art. The latter is political activism injected into and posing as art. There is a substantial difference between worlds created with their own political and social systems and heavy-handed political messaging that was clearly squeezed into the script because whoever wrote the line probably got into a Twitter argument earlier that morning and needed to vent.
First of all, you will never be me.
What Lucas did in the prequels was explore an idea, and perhaps to get his audience, if they cared to think about it, to explore that idea as well. And while the prequels are hardly universally adored, it's safe to say the criticisms of those movies focus more on the quality of the writing than they do on the political themes. Coincidentally enough, and I do believe it was a coincidence, the prequels came out right around the start of the War on Terror, an event that precipitated unprecedented amounts of power being granted to the executive branch of the United States government.
Coincidence? I think not!
But did any of you notice that? Because I sure didn't. For one thing, because George W. Bush, unlike Palpatine, did not stay in power for the next 30 years. And for another, because the politics of the prequels belonged in their world. They fit there. They were not constructed in a ham-fisted, preachy manner that ensured everyone would understand the metaphor, because George Lucas was, first and foremost, a world builder and a storyteller. He cared more about what his audience would get out of his movies than how much of himself he put in. And that legacy of his lives on in Andor, whose plot is undeniably political, and yet Tony Gilroy clearly had no intention of trying to impose his own opinions on hot-button social issues. Rather, he wanted to explore how autocracies establish and maintain power, and how their actions may produce the very thing they intend to suppress, all told through the lens of the people experiencing that struggle on the ground level.
Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear.
People can draw whatever parallels they want to our modern world and political systems, and I'm sure they have, but Andor is clearly missing any of the condescending, sanctimonious quote-unquote lessons that so many other properties have tried to impart upon their audiences. Unless you count fascism is bad, I suppose, but that's pretty universally agreed upon to be true. The two sides of the aisle just can't seem to agree who the fascists actually are. And that's about as politically charged a statement as you'll hear me make on this channel. Because although these videos are largely made by me and me alone, I do try to focus them on a particular theme: why stories matter. I do put myself into the scripts, it's unavoidable, but I am not the product. I don't teach the lessons, I don't inspire or influence. The stories do, the characters do. My analyses are, ideally, merely a vessel through which, I hope, my viewers can better understand and appreciate the works of men and women who are far more talented than I am. Which brings me back to a point I made a moment ago about Lucas caring more about his audience getting something out of Star Wars than he did about putting himself into that world. This is what storytellers should aspire to do, because it shows that they care more about the experience of the watchers, readers, or players than they do about feeling satisfied with themselves. Now, it's obviously impossible to tell a story without putting something of yourself into it. Your worldview, philosophy, and what you value will obviously influence the tale you tell or the way in which you craft that narrative. However, Do you have a philosophy which you want to elucidate? Do you have a theme which you want to explore? Do you have characters whose journeys and arcs will inspire or serve as cautionary tales? Are you writing this story for people you hope will love it and cherish it? Or because you want to hear it? Because you have something to say and damn it, someone had better listen?
What would you say you do here?
The answer to that last question is naturally the most important one. When we get moments like this,
There's only one business in the galaxy that'll get you this rich.
War.
they are rarely well integrated into the story. Quite often, they will jar the viewer out of their immersion in the narrative, which is antithetical to the very art of storytelling. Why is this being brought up now? Does it have any impact on the world or the plot? No. For one thing, it's an idiotic statement, since this war to which Rose refers is, well, this. And obviously, there are a gazillion other ways by which one could obtain ridiculous levels of wealth in the Star Wars galaxy. For another, it simply isn't ever relevant again, except perhaps when Benicio del Toro's character tells Finn that the weapons dealer sells ships to the good guys and the bad, and how rich exactly could anyone get selling X-Wings to the Not Rebellion? They have like 20 of them. Anyway, point being that inserting some convoluted point about the military-industrial complex being corrupt and uncaring about good and evil simply wasn't worked into the story. It wasn't a plotline that was explored, it didn't provide any meaningful character growth, it just appeared to be on someone's mind while they were writing Finn and Rose's highly unnecessary scenes, and somehow got included in the final edit. As another example, let's rewind to the Make Numenor Great Again speech, which is another beat that feels like it was forced into the narrative as a random political potshot, because that's exactly what it was. No Numenorian was worried about an elf stealing his blacksmithing business. Some of the men of Numenor were jealous of the elves' immortality and closeness to the Valar, but to twist that distaste of theirs into a year-specific gripe because you just have to try and score some political points is just plain silly. Political or social message injections like this absolutely scream, "My opinion on this issue is more important than your story."
That's where you're wrong, kiddo.
It's not. It never will be. Here's the problem, though. Any storyteller is saying something with his or her story. If you're not, your story isn't worth telling. And while I generally think a good rule is to adhere to universal truths when you are crafting the themes for your stories, there isn't always exactly complete agreement among humankind as to what those universal truths are. Any belief about anything can be challenged, can be considered controversial, and thus political. If you don't like The Last Jedi, which I don't, and think that Admiral Holdo was a terrible leader, which I do, you will likely want to back up that opinion. And to do so, you might examine the potential motivation of the writers to write Holdo as they did. And you might conclude that she was likely placed on that bridge because she's a woman who doesn't look like most people's idea of an admiral, and Rian Johnson wanted to subvert our expectations by having her take charge and shut down Flyby Poe. Is that conclusion which I reached an inherently political one? Well, let's look at the premises that I believe to be true. Rian Johnson enjoys subverting audience expectations, and Disney, perhaps Hollywood in general, want to place women in traditionally male-dominated roles. The first premise isn't remotely political, obviously. It's merely an opinion on Johnson's style of writing and directing, one that is quite widely shared. The second, however, is the promotion of women, the propping up, some might say, a political issue. Short answer, not really, but yes. Long answer, it isn't inherently, but it is, because just about anything to do with any type of identity one might claim has been swept up into the political realm. Thinking that Admiral Holdo was a disastrously bad leader, and that the movie treating her as if she was in the right all along, and thinking that she was given a pass because of her gender, is not a political opinion, but rather a social one. However, we tend to conflate the two. I've done so several times in this script. Picking a side in a social argument must mean that you're on the same side as the majority of people who agree with you. And so many people, maybe most people, will assume a great deal about your political beliefs if you think that way. Or they'll make the opposite assumptions if you think she was justified in acting as she did. I mean, I've heard a gaming YouTuber talk about how he basically became a Republican temporarily after watching The Last Jedi because he hated it, because it's a bad movie. And the only people on the internet who also seemed to hate it were guys like Ben Shapiro. This is what happens when modern-day political hot takes or social issues are inserted into stories that are meant to be loved by a massive audience from both sides of the aisle, as well as from the narthex and the transepts. And if you're thinking, Sam, are you saying studios aren't supposed to have any women of power or authority or influence so as to not provoke the chuds, the incels, and whatever other idiotic insult is being thrown around Reddit this month? Then I have a video that you might want to watch. Seriously, I wish someone would watch this video already. It's been really underperforming. At the same time, however, yes, if you want to succeed as a business, you should absolutely cater to your audience.
Are you not entertained?
I know more than you.
If you don't like your customers and want to change them, become a therapist, not a screenwriter. If your thought process is, our core audience won't like this, but we know better than they do, so we're going to include it anyway for their own good, your product is going to fail and will be swept aside by stories that actually play to the crowd. If you want proof, let's look at the biggest box office hits of this year. Inside Out 2, a family movie with absolutely nothing preachy and no divisive social issues presented. Deadpool and Wolverine, by all accounts just a lot of dumb superhero fun. Despicable Me 4, wait, really? They're still making those? Anyway, no message or politics as far as I can tell. Dune Part 2, not exactly lacking in politics, but said politics are of Dune's world, not ours. Twisters. It's Twisters. I think you get the point. Now look, I don't mean to come off as one-sided and biased in this video. I am, but I don't mean to come off that way. If it seems like I've been overly critical of liberal viewpoints being injected into works of art, well, those are the examples available. For every my panda, my choice, there is not a panda's a panda no matter how small, because Hollywood is overwhelmingly liberal. So, in the words of Adam Lambert, what do you want from me? But in the interest of fairness, let's take a look at this pile of garbage from the right side of the aisle, entitled The New Norm.
Hey, pronoun. This bud's for you.
Offensive. Okay, I think that's quite enough of that. Putting aside the fact that this sounds like it was written by an AI trained exclusively on anti-woke Facebook memes, and the fact that it has a laugh track for absolutely no reason at all, this shit is not remotely the solution to the woke mind virus. If you believe that good art is being ruined by the other side of the political aisle, the correct response is to make good art yourself, not to do the exact same thing you've been complaining about for a decade now. And while sure, you could say that this is political satire, but satire is supposed to be funny, and thus not exactly the same thing as a giant beloved franchise becoming politically divisive, I have to ask, how is this helping? This garbage is clearly created by people who think a certain way, for people who think a certain way. If it ever actually gets generated, it will only be watched by people with the exact same mindset of the main character of that trailer, and nothing of value will be accomplished.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
As I've said before, create worlds and characters in order to tell a story, not to prove a point. Have a personal philosophy. Determine how that philosophy can be shown through the story's themes. Figure out how to have characters live out those themes. Create meaningful and sensible character arcs, and so on and so forth. If you do want to convert people to your way of thinking and you are a writer or director, the best way to do that is to tell a good story. To provoke admiration by producing high-quality works of art which depict your philosophy in poignant and thought-provoking ways. Even if I don't agree with your worldview at every turn, I will most certainly respect the fact that you decided to show it to me through characters and a world that you created, instead of dropping in disjointed tidbits of it in a way that jar me right out of the story you're allegedly trying to tell.
You're not all boys. So?
I mean, there are a great many issues about which I am deeply passionate, and which I believe to be of great moral importance, and yet you don't hear me say things like, my expectations for this show were high, but not as high as the tariffs on potatoes, because that's not what this channel is. That's not what you are here for. If I fall prey to that temptation to use my platform to grandstand about social affairs unrelated to the story, character, or theme which I am discussing that week, then I will break the implicit trust between content creator and viewer. The trust that you have in me, hopefully, to deliver thoughtful analyses of a given narrative, arc, or trend within the storytelling industry. If you wanted to hear my political opinions, you would be subscribed to my politics channel. In the same vein, if you, a creative in Hollywood, want to talk about political issue X, make a movie about it. Could be a documentary, could be a political comedy, could be whatever. But be honest about what that film is. I don't imagine most people complained about politics in movies when Vice premiered, because of course a film about a former vice president is going to include politics. When we get down to the core of the issue, it really is at least mostly about honesty. When Hollywood writers sneak in these jarring, ill-fitting lines or story beats that have political or social undertones, it jolts the audience out of their immersion and evokes a negative reaction, perhaps even for those who agree with said messaging, but who care enough about their philosophy or worldview to be annoyed by it being presented in this clumsy, ham-fisted manner. The first few times you do it, you'll probably avoid any long-term backlash, but if you insist on continuing down this path, eventually you'll arrive where the MCU did last year, with a movie whose main draw was the identities of its three leads, directed by someone who is pretty honest about being an activist filmmaker. But audiences didn't want said activism, at least not the audiences of the MCU. Basically, The Marvels was the intersectional equivalent of Christian movies. It was open and honest about who it was for, and thus was significantly limited in its audience. Whether you agree or disagree with the message of such films, secular or religious, you cannot deny that, by and large, fans of fantasy, sci-fi, and superhero genres aren't interested in hearing a homily in the theater. We want to be inspired by the heroism of the protagonists. We want to see them struggle, falter, and even fall, so we can watch them get back up again. We want fearsome villains who, however understandable they may or may not be, are not painted as justifiable in their actions. And we want uplifting and inventive stories told by people who care more about telling those stories than they do about piling up purposeless political points.